The sky split open with a silent flash, and then the world ended. No warning. No sirens. No last-minute pleas for peace. One moment, the streets of Earth pulsed with life. Children laughing in city squares, engines roaring through neon-lit highways, voices filling the air with a symphony of existence. The next, those voices were gone, replaced by the hollow stillness of absence. A brilliant, blinding wave of energy swept across continents, and when it faded, nothing remained but charred ruins and lifeless craters where entire civilizations once stood. Not just Earth. The colonies, Europa, Titan, Proxima Centauri, fell in the same fashion, wiped from existence in hours. Every human settlement across the stars was systematically erased, as if our kind had never existed. It was precise. It was absolute. It was impersonal. And then, just as quickly as they had come, they vanished. No occupation. No demands. No explanation. They didn't come to conquer. They came to erase. Those who survived didn't have time to mourn. The lucky few who weren't caught in the first wave, pilots on deep space patrols, miners working asteroid belts, researchers in isolated outposts, had barely enough time to process what had happened before the truth set in. Humanity was no longer a civilization. We were a scattered, leaderless people with no home, no government, and no future. For the first time in history, we were nothing. But war is never truly lost while even a handful remain to fight. At first, we were phantoms, shadows flickering in the void, whispering across encrypted channels, hiding in the forgotten corners of space. We had no fleets, no weapons powerful enough to strike back. What little remained of our technology was outdated and scarce. The old governments were gone, their leaders either dead or unreachable. It would have been easy to disappear, to become nothing more than the last ghosts of a species that had once reached for the stars. But ghosts remember. And ghosts don't forgive. We learned. We scoured the wreckage they left behind. Fragments of ships, data cores half destroyed in the firestorms, broken transmissions buried under layers of static. We pieced together everything we could. We watched their movements. We analyzed their attacks. And slowly, over years of silence, we traced them back to the source. Our executioners had a name. The Zalari. They were not gods, nor unstoppable forces of nature. They were flesh and blood, mortal as we were. Their ships, sleek and vast, were built on principles we barely understood, but not beyond understanding. Their weapons, brutal and precise, were devastating, but not infallible. And most importantly, they had a home. It was hidden deep beyond the known star maps, a world shrouded in secrecy. They had never expected us to find it. After all, they had reduced our people to a handful of stragglers clinging to survival. We were nothing to them. Forgotten remnants. A species on the brink of extinction. But they had made a fatal mistake. They believed we had no patience, no cunning, no will to endure. They were wrong. It took years. Years of silence, of careful sabotage, of striking at the edges of their empire while making them believe they were suffering internal fractures. We turned them against each other, infiltrated their systems, rewrote their data. We became the monsters in their shadows, the unseen enemy gnawing at the foundation of their invincible empire. And when the time came, when we had learned everything we could, we emerged from the void, not as refugees, not as survivors, but as hunters. A fleet of stolen ships, engineered from the very technology they had used to destroy us, slipped past their defenses like ghosts in the night. The first strike hit their outer stations before they even realized what was happening. By the time their alarms sounded, it was too late. Their cities burned. Their warships, once untouchable, crumbled under the weight of their own arrogance. Fires raged in the skies above them, casting eerie, flickering shadows over the world they had built on the graves of others. 4 years, they had ruled through terror, believing no enemy could ever rise against them. And now, for the first time in their history, they were afraid. They had spent so long looking over their shoulders, fearing the return of the species they had tried to erase. That fear had finally come true. They had burned our worlds to the ground. Now we burned theirs. The Zalari homeworld burned beneath us, its once pristine skyline collapsing into an inferno of twisted metal and molten stone. The airwaves, once filled with their arrogant silence, now crackled with distress signals, panic transmissions, and the unmistakable sound of a civilization realizing, too late, that it was mortal. I stood on the bridge of the Salvation's Blade, watching the chaos unfold through the reinforced viewport. Even from orbit, I could see the devastation spreading like a sickness. Zalari ships swarmed in desperate counterattacks, but we had planned for this. We had studied their tactics, predicted their movements, and set traps within their own defenses. Now, their fleets fractured under the weight of our precision strikes. A voice crackled over the comms. Sector 4 secured. No survivors. Another followed. Orbital batteries neutralized. They won't be firing back. A third, colder than the others. The palace is gone. If their leaders were inside, they're dead. I exhaled slowly, pressing a hand against the cold metal railing. The weight of this moment should have felt victorious. It should have been satisfying. But there was no triumph in watching a world die, even one that had tried to erase us. Jareth, my second in command, leaned in beside me. His uniform was torn, a thin cut running down his temple, but his eyes burned with a grim satisfaction. "It's over," he murmured. I didn't answer. Because I knew it wasn't. We had spent years preparing for this day, shaping ourselves into the blade that would carve vengeance into the bones of the enemy. But war doesn't end when the last missile lands or the final ship falls from the sky. War lingers. It sinks into the marrow of those who fight it and twists them into something unrecognizable. And as I watched the Zalari flee into the darkness, abandoning their doomed homeworld to its fate, I realized something unsettling. They had feared our return. But they had never truly fought to stop it. "Pull the long-range scans," I ordered. Jareth frowned. "For what?" "Survivors," I lied. In truth, I wasn't looking for survivors. I was looking for something else, something I couldn't quite put into words. The Zalari were brutal, methodical, and merciless. They had erased entire worlds without hesitation. But they had never occupied them, never repurposed them, never even looted them. Why? I turned back to the viewport, watching the flames devour what was left of their capital. If the Zalari were truly the galaxy's apex predators, they should have torn through humanity without a second thought. But instead, they had struck hard and then disappeared, as if afraid of something. As if they hadn't come to conquer, but to cleanse. A chill crept into my bones. What if we weren't there first? I murmured. Jareth stiffened. What? I kept my eyes on the burning planet. What if we weren't the first species they wiped out? What if they've done this before? His silence told me he had already considered the same thing. The comms flared to life again. "Admiral, we're detecting movement at the edge of the system. Small crafts. No identifiable markers." Jareth straightened. "Survivors." "Unlikely," I said. "Patch it through." A moment later, the grainy hollow display flickered to life. The ships were barely visible against the vast emptiness of space, their designs unlike anything I had ever seen. They weren't Zalari. They weren't ours. And they weren't running. They were waiting. Jareth swore under his breath. Who the hell are they? The answer lodged itself in my mind like a sliver of ice. If the Zalari had wiped out others before us, then it stood to reason that someone had noticed. And if someone had noticed, then maybe, just maybe, we had walked straight into a war that had started long before humanity ever reached the stars. The wreckage of the Zalari homeworld still smoldered behind us, its dying embers reflected in the Salvation's Blade's reinforced glass. But my attention was fixed elsewhere. The distant ships at the edge of the system remained motionless, their dark hulls merging with the void. They did not move to attack. They did not attempt to flee. They only watched. Jareth stood beside me, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "They're not running," he muttered. "No," I agreed, my voice tight. "They were already here." The thought sank into my mind like a stone. The Zalari had feared something more than us. Their war against humanity had never been about conquest or dominance. It had been about survival. And now, staring at the silent ships that had lingered at the edge of this battlefield, I suspected why. I straightened. "Open a channel." The comms officer hesitated, fingers hovering over the controls. The silence on the bridge was thick, expectant. Then, with a nod, she patched us through. Static flooded the speakers. A voice followed, guttural and sharp, layered with distortion. The language was unrecognizable, but the tone was not. It was calm, unhurried, as if whoever was speaking had been expecting this. "Run it through translation," Jareth said. The ship's AI worked fast, filtering the patterns, breaking apart the syntax, mapping it against every known linguistic structure. Slowly, meaning emerged from the chaos. The voice returned, this time in words we understood. "Human vessel. You have broken the cycle." The weight of those words settled deep in my chest. I felt Jareth shift beside me, inhaling sharply, but he said nothing. I gripped the console. "Identify yourself." A pause. Then, "We are the witnesses." The name meant nothing, and yet, it sent a chill down my spine. "Why were you watching?" "We watch all cycles. We record. We do not interfere." The phrasing was precise, almost rehearsed, like a ritual recitation. A dozen questions stormed my mind, but one clawed its way forward first. "The Zalari," I said. "Were they part of your cycle?" "All species are." Jareth swore under his breath. "That's not an answer." I ignored him. "The Zalari tried to wipe us out. Did they do the same to others?" Silence stretched between us. Then, finally, "Yes." The word dropped like a hammer. A single syllable, weighted with something ancient and terrible. I swallowed, my throat dry. "How many?" The voice didn't hesitate. 432. A hush fell over the bridge. Jareth exhaled, long and slow. "They destroyed over 400 civilizations?" "No," the voice corrected. 432 species have been purged. By the cycle. A sharp, twisting fear curled in my gut. The cycle. What does that mean? The transmission wavered, static creeping in, as if the universe itself resisted the truth. "The Zalari were not the beginning," the voice said. "They were the last iteration. Before them, another species cleansed the stars. Before them, another. One rises, one falls. Always." Jareth tensed beside me. "That doesn't make sense. If each dominant species is erased, how does it continue?" The answer came too quickly. Because the executioners become the next victims. My stomach turned. The realization settled over me like a slow, suffocating weight. The Zalari had never been predators. They had been prey, running from a fate they knew was inevitable. And in their desperation, they had ensured it wouldn't be them. They had wiped us out to buy time. And now, we had wiped them out. Jareth turned to me, his jaw clenched. "Do you see where this is going?" I did. I saw it too clearly. We had assumed victory. We had assumed vengeance was the end. But we hadn't ended the war. We had inherited it. The realization settled over the bridge like a storm. The crew shifted uneasily, their earlier exhilaration bleeding away into something colder, something darker. We had celebrated too soon. The comms crackled again, the voice quieter now, almost reluctant. "You were not meant to survive, human. The cycle is broken. You must prepare." I forced my voice to remain steady. "Prepare for what?" Silence. Then, "They will come." And then the transmission cut out. The bridge remained still. The words echoed in the silence, pressing into us like unseen hands. Jareth was the first to break it. "We need to leave." I didn't answer. My gaze lingered on the distant ships, still motionless, still watching. The witnesses. Silent recorders of a war older than our species. The Zalari had believed in the cycle so completely that they had massacred billions to escape it. But they had failed. And now we were next. I turned away from the viewport. "Bring the fleet into formation. Prepare for immediate departure." Jareth hesitated. "Where?" I met his gaze. "To find out who they are. And to learn if we had just signed humanity's death sentence." The fleet drifted through the remnants of war, engines running silent, hulls scorched from battle. The Zalari homeworld was now little more than a graveyard, burning against the backdrop of a cold, indifferent cosmos. The victory that should have been a triumph sat heavy in my chest, bitter and hollow. We had fought. We had won. But we had also inherited something far worse. Jareth stood near the tactical display, arms crossed, his brow furrowed. His uniform was still stained with soot and blood from the last engagement, but he hadn't left the bridge. None of us had. Sleep felt irrelevant when the shape of the war had changed beneath our feet. "We can't stay here," he said finally, voice low but firm. The witnesses weren't giving us a warning. They were issuing a sentence. I turned away from the viewport, away from the fires of a dead empire. "I know." The fleet's officers watched us in tense silence, waiting for direction. Their faces were drawn, hollowed by exhaustion, but behind that weariness was something more dangerous: fear. These were soldiers, people who had fought tooth and nail against an enemy that had nearly driven humanity to extinction. And yet, what we had learned from the witnesses had rattled them more than the Zalari ever could. Jareth leaned in. What if they were right? What if we weren't supposed to survive? I let the question hang between us. I had asked myself the same thing since the witnesses' transmission cut out. The Zalari had followed the cycle, believing it was their only path to salvation. In their eyes, we had been an infection to purge. And now, the universe would see us the same way. "We find out who they are," I said finally. "Before they find us." Jareth nodded, but I could see the unease in his posture. He didn't argue. He knew there was no other option. "Helm," I called out. "Set a course. Wide scan of the nearest systems. Anything that doesn't match known species, I want it flagged." A murmur of confirmation rippled through the bridge. Engines hummed to life. The fleet turned away from the wreckage of the Zalari, their broken world shrinking behind us. The past had been erased. Now we had to decide if humanity had a future. The search took days. Days of restless silence, of scouring distant systems for anything that could explain what we were up against. We found ruins, old, abandoned, civilizations reduced to little more than dust and echoes. The remains of the cycle. It was in the fourth system that we found something alive. The transmission hit us before we even entered orbit. A single signal, pulsing on an ancient frequency, encoded in a language no human had ever spoken. It shouldn't have made sense. And yet, when the translation AI processed it, the words emerged with haunting clarity. "You are already seen." I straightened. The crew tensed. Jareth's hand drifted to his sidearm, an old habit, as if instinct alone could fight off whatever had just spoken across the void. The signal didn't repeat. "Locate the source," I ordered. The scanners locked onto a point on the planet below. A structure, buried beneath layers of dust and time. A city. It wasn't Zalari. It wasn't human. And yet, something about it felt familiar. Not in its architecture or design, but in the way it was abandoned. As if it had been left behind in a hurry. As if the people who built it had vanished before they could finish their last thought. Jareth exhaled. "It's a trap." "Of course it is," I said. "But we're going anyway." The dropship descended in silence, cutting through the thin atmosphere. The city stretched beneath us, vast and empty, its streets coated in the pale residue of centuries-old decay. Buildings stood intact, untouched by time or war, yet utterly lifeless. The wind howled through corridors of forgotten stone. No bodies. No wreckage. Just absence. "This place gives me a bad feeling," one of the soldiers muttered. Jareth scanned the surroundings, his expression grim. Bad feeling might be an understatement. We pressed forward. Every step felt too loud, the silence pressing in from all sides. The structures loomed over us, their facade smooth and unmarked. No signs of war. No destruction. As if the people here had simply stopped. Then we reached the center of the city. The monument stood tall, carved from dark metal, its surface etched with symbols that pulsed faintly, as if still alive. At its base, embedded in the stone, was a single inscription. A translation flickered on my visor. "The last of our kind." We thought we were the exception. We were wrong. My breath hitched. Jareth took a slow step back. This wasn't just any civilization. His voice was quiet. This was the last one before the Zalari. The realization slithered through me like ice. The cycle wasn't just history. It wasn't theory. It was real. And we were standing in the remains of those who had thought, like we had, that they had escaped it. I turned sharply. Back to the ship. Now. We moved fast, instincts screaming at us to leave. The shadows seemed deeper than before. The air heavier. We had touched something we weren't meant to, and the universe had noticed. By the time we reached orbit, the comms flared again. A new signal. No distortion. No translation needed. A single message. Clear and final. You are seen. Then, on the edge of our long-range scanners, ships began to appear. One by one. Row after row. A fleet larger than anything the Zalari had ever fielded. Waiting. The cycle had not ended. It had only found its new target. The void had never felt heavier. The Salvation's blade moved through space with a silence that pressed against the walls. A silence that none of us dared break. The jump had saved us. But only barely. The architects had let us run. For now. Jareth stood at the helm, his knuckles white against the console. His breathing had slowed, but I could tell his mind was still racing. Just like mine. We had seen what should not exist. We had spoken to something ancient, something patient. And worst of all, we had learned the truth. The cycle was real. And we were next. The architects had hunted civilizations into extinction for longer than we could comprehend, wiping away species the moment they reached the peak of their power. They called it balance. They called it order. But it was execution, nothing more. The universe was their garden, and we were weeds that had grown too high. Jareth finally turned, his voice flat. How long until they find us again? Our navigator, Lieutenant Reza, hesitated before answering. Not long. Maybe days. They can track our slipstream. I'm running recalculations, but if they have predictive algorithms, they'll know exactly where to look. Jareth exhaled sharply. Great. Love that. I studied the star maps flickering before me. Dozens of routes, none of them promising. The edges of the known galaxy were filled with dust and darkness, graveyards of species that had thought they were safe. If we kept running, we would only be delaying the inevitable. We need a plan, Jareth said. We need answers, I countered. His jaw tightened. You think there's a way to stop them? They hesitated, I said. That got his attention. His eyes narrowed. Once. For a second. But they did, I insisted. When we turned to face them, they didn't react the way they should have. That means something. Jareth ran a hand through his hair, frustration clear on his face. Or maybe it means nothing. Maybe they were just recalculating. You're looking for weakness, and I get that, but these things don't have weaknesses. They've been doing this for, hell, who even knows how long? Longer than we've had fire. He wasn't wrong. But he wasn't right either. We're missing something, I said. A piece of the puzzle. They don't just watch civilizations. They let them reach a breaking point. They wait until a species becomes dominant before striking. Why? Jareth crossed his arms. Because they think it'll prevent collapse. Do you believe that? His silence was answer enough. Reza cut in. Captain, I think I found something. I turned. Her screen displayed an old, decayed signal buried beneath the interference from our jump. It was faint, barely there, but the structure of it was familiar. Zalari? Jareth asked. Reza nodded. One of their deep space transmissions. It must have been bouncing between relay points when their homeworld fell. I isolated part of it. It's fragmented, but the AI reconstructed some of the missing segments. The message played. The first, nothing but static. Then a voice, Zalari, but distorted, fraying at the edges. This is Command Unit 12. Our calculations are incorrect. We misunderstood. The architects are not the end. They are the... Silence. Then the file cut off entirely. Reza frowned. That's all we have. The rest was corrupted. Jareth scowled. Not the end? Then what the hell are they? A question I had been asking since the first moment I heard their voices. I straightened. Patch into whatever Zalari databases we recovered from their planetary systems. Search for anything connected to the architects, the cycle, anything. Reza moved quickly, pulling up layers of encrypted archives. The Zalari had been methodical, obsessive in their documentation. They had believed themselves to be the final survivors, the ones who would beat the cycle. Somewhere in their desperation, they must have uncovered something we could use. Minutes passed. Then, I found something, Reza said. The main screen shifted, displaying a collection of translated Zalari files. They were old, deeply classified, likely meant for only the highest-ranking officers. And yet, despite their secrecy, there was an undeniable sense of fear embedded in the words. The cycle is older than we believed. The architects are not the first to enforce it. We are beginning to suspect they are not the last. A second file. There is something beneath them. We do not know what. We only know that the architects were given their task, just as we were given ours. They are bound to it as we are bound to survival. But if they are not the ones who created the cycle, then... The rest of the file was missing. Jareth stared at the screen. That's not possible. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. The architects were enforcers, but not the ones who had set this in motion. Reza spoke first. That means there's someone, something, above them. Jareth swore under his breath. As if this wasn't bad enough. I exhaled slowly, thoughts racing. The Zalari believed they could escape by playing along. But if the architects are just following orders, then that means... They're not the ones in control, Jareth finished grimly. We had spent so long fearing the architects. But what if we had been looking at this the wrong way? What if they were nothing more than messengers? The void outside the ship felt larger than before. I clenched my fists. We're done running. Jareth gave a short, humorless laugh. And what exactly do you propose? We asked them who's pulling their strings. No, I said. We find out ourselves. Reza looked up sharply. You're talking about infiltrating an architect ship? I met her gaze. If we want to know the truth, we have to get inside their systems. We have to see what they see. Silence. Then Jareth exhaled and shook his head. You're insane. That's why we're still alive, I said. For the first time since the battle, something flickered in his eyes. Not just exhaustion. Not just defiance. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, we had found the first crack in the cycle. Hope that the architects were not as invincible as they seemed. I turned back to the star map, eyes narrowing at the growing mass of hostile signals lurking just beyond our reach. For the first time, we weren't just surviving. We were hunting. The Salvation's blade moved through the void like a predator in deep water, silent and unseen. The galaxy had never felt so vast, yet for the first time, we weren't running from extinction. We were moving toward something. A truth buried beneath the weight of countless fallen civilizations. The architects weren't the true masters of the cycle. They were enforcers, following orders given by something older, something unseen. And if we had any hope of breaking this endless pattern of annihilation, we needed to know who had built it in the first place. Jareth leaned over the navigation console, watching the red blips on the scanner. There it is, he murmured. One of their forward command ships. The vessel loomed in the distance, a monolithic shadow against the stars. Its surface pulsed with an eerie luminescence, shifting in patterns we couldn't decipher. There were no visible weapons, no external ports. It was a fortress without doors. I exhaled slowly. Take us in. Full stealth protocols. The ship moved closer, engines dampened, hull temperature matching the ambient cold of space. Every movement was calculated, every breath measured. The architects were machines of precision, but even machines had blind spots. Reza's voice was tight. There's no external docking point. We'll have to breach. Jareth frowned. You sure about this? I glanced at him. No. But we didn't have a choice. The breaching pod detached from our hull, cutting through the black in total silence. It latched onto the architect vessel, and a small drill began slicing through the smooth exterior. No alarms. No response. As if the ship itself hadn't noticed. Or as if it didn't care. We entered through the breach one by one, weapons drawn. The interior was a cathedral of quiet, corridors stretching in strange, fluid curves. The walls pulsed faintly, almost organic. The architects did not build with steel and rivets. Their ships were grown. Jareth's voice was barely above a whisper. Where's the crew? There was nothing. No guards. No movement. Only silence. Reza scanned the structure. I'm picking up energy signatures ahead. Something's active. We moved forward, footsteps muffled by the strange, almost fabric-like flooring. Every part of the ship felt unnatural, as if it had been designed by something that understood structure but not life. Then we found the core. A vast chamber stretched before us, filled with vertical pillars of shifting light. The air vibrated with an unseen force, making the hairs on my arms rise. At the center, suspended above the ground, was a single construct. Massive, intricate, pulsating like a heartbeat. Reza's voice was tight. This isn't a reactor. I stepped closer. The structure was smooth, seamless, yet my instinct screamed that it was alive. Not in the way a creature was, but in the way a mind was. A network. A presence. Jareth muttered. What the hell are we looking at? Then the voice spoke. Not from speakers. Not from any system we could detect. From inside our own minds. You do not belong here. Jareth recoiled, his rifle snapping up. Okay, no. Absolutely not. I forced myself to stay still. Who are you? A pause. Then. We are the architects. We are the will of the cycle. You have trespassed. I clenched my jaw. The cycle is broken. The chamber pulsed, a rhythmic thrum that wasn't sound but something deeper, something felt in the marrow. The cycle cannot be broken. You do not understand what you are. Jareth took a step forward. No, you don't understand what we are. We survived. The Zalari thought they could kill us, and they failed. You thought you could wipe us out, and here we are. Silence stretched between us, thick as gravity. Then, for the first time, something shifted. Laughter. Not human. Not mechanical. A soundless, crawling sensation in the back of my skull. Survival does not mean victory. You have only delayed the inevitable. A sickening realization settled over me. You're not the ones who started the cycle. The pulse in the room slowed. A hesitation. A crack. Reza inhaled sharply. You're not in control. The hum in the chamber deepened. The lights flickered. We are the enforcers. The cycle was given to us. Jareth's voice was sharp. By who? Silence. Then. They are coming. The pulse in the room surged, and suddenly the entire ship shuddered. Reza swore. Something's happening. Power fluctuations. Wait, we triggered something. The walls groaned. The smooth organic surfaces twisted, shifting into something sharper, darker. The ship wasn't just waking up. It was reacting. We need to go, Jareth said. I turned back to the suspended construct. This wasn't just a power source. It was them. Their mind. Their network. Collective intelligence stretching across every ship, every fleet. If we left it intact, they would follow us. They would never stop. I raised my weapon. Reza's eyes widened. Captain. I fired. The impact sent a ripple through the structure. For a moment, nothing happened. Then everything collapsed. The chamber screamed. Not sound, something deeper, something that rattled through bone and soul. The ship convulsed as cracks splintered through the walls, black veins spreading through the pulsating light. Jareth grabbed my arm. Move, move. We ran. The ship was disintegrating around us, its own consciousness unraveling from the inside. By the time we reached the breach pod, alarms finally blared, a soundless, mind-rattling wail of something vast dying. The pod launched, streaking back toward the Salvation's blade. The moment we cleared the architect vessel, it imploded. Not an explosion. Not fire. Just erasure. 1 second it existed. The next it did not. Silence filled the bridge as we landed. No cheers. No relief. Only the weight of what we had just done. Jareth rubbed his temples. Did we just kill a god? I exhaled slowly. No. I turned back to the viewport. In the distance, beyond the dying embers of the architect's ship, space itself seemed to ripple. A presence. Something watching. Something waking up. We just killed its messenger. The cycle was broken. But something far worse had noticed. And it was coming. I straightened, my hand steady. Set course. Jareth frowned. For where? I met his gaze. For whoever started the cycle. For the first time in history, humanity wasn't waiting for extinction. We were hunting the ones who had written our fate. And we weren't going to stop.